Well, good afternoon and happy Sabbath to you all, and to those here in Australia and around the world on the webcast, I welcome you as well. Now, if I were to ask you what is the most difficult parable of Jesus to understand, which one would it be? Now, chances are you'd probably answer with either of the two parables that are found in Luke chapter 16, either the parable of the unjust steward or the parable of Lazarus and the rich man. Now, personally, I found those to be two of the most challenging parables to understand. Now, some parables of Jesus are fairly easy to interpret, while others take diligent study to unlock their meaning. Now, today I'd like to explore the parable of the unjust steward and hopefully provide a little more clarity to understand this rather tricky parable. Now, the parable starts in verse 1 of Luke 16, where we read, he, talking about Jesus, also said to his disciples, now there was a certain rich man who had a steward, and an accusation was brought to him that this man was wasting his goods. So he called him and said to him, what is this I hear about you? Give an account of your stewardship, for you can no longer be steward. So we see that the parable begins with a rich man calling his steward before him to inform him that he will be relieving him of his duties of mismanaging his master's resources. Now, a steward is a person who manages the resources of another. Now, the steward had authority over all the master's resources and could transact business in his name. Now, this required the utmost level of trust in that steward. Now, in a mostly agrarian society, those who farmed the land earned their money after they had harvested their crops. However, farmers still had bills to pay throughout the year, and so many of them would borrow money which they would pay back with a share of their future harvest. Now, this rich man financed loans to these farmers, which were managed by this steward. Now, a less likely possibility is that the rich man had a large estate consisting of land divided into portions, and the debtors might be renters who have agreed to pay a fixed amount of produce for the yearly rent. Now, I said that this is the less likely of the two possibilities, as there was a much higher percentage of farmers who owned their land in Israel as opposed to renting land due to the inheritance system that God had put in place in Israel, as compared to the feudal system that later developed in Europe. Now, we see further into the parable that the currency of the debts was oil with one debtor and wheat for another debtor. Now, the master was probably a man of good character, as he cared enough to fire a wasteful manager when someone reported it to him. Now, continuing on, we read, and the steward said within himself, what shall I do? For my Lord is taking the stewardship away from me. I cannot dig. I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I will do, so that when I am put out of the stewardship, that they may receive me into their houses. So he called every one of the Lord's debtors and said to the first, how much do you owe my master? And he said, 100 measures of oil. And he said to him, take your bill and sit down quickly and write 50. And he said to another, and how much do you owe? And he said, 100 measures of wheat. And he said to him, take your bill and write 80. Now the steward has been called out, so he concocts a plan to save his own skin. Now in verse 2, he was told that you can no longer be steward. Now his master has probably suspended him from being steward while he gives an account of his stewardship, which may later lead to his dismissal. He says, for my master is taking the stewardship away from me. He is taking, but not yet taken away, the stewardship. Now his master's tenants would be unaware that he is about to be dismissed, so he takes advantage of that. Now he's too lazy to dig and work the land, and too proud to beg, so he decides to cut some deals with his master's debtors to change how much they owe the master. And if these deals are good, then they may provide him with help and shelter if he is later fired. Now, with the first, he arranges a 50% discount of his debt of oil to the master. With the second, he arranges a 20% discount of his debt of wheat to the master. Now, notice in both cases he has the debtor change it with their own handwriting rather than his, so the steward cannot be accused of changing it with his own hand. Now, some commentators believe that he was cooking the books, while other commentators argue that he was actually trying to fix the books. Now, this is what one commentator, Dennis Ireland, writes about the view that the steward was actually fixing the books. He writes, Schultz argues that prior to the time of the steward's dismissal, he had been extracting more from the debtors than he actually turned over to his master, perhaps using the difference to support a wanton lifestyle. The debt reductions then were not a falsification of the records, but rather a rectification of past wrongs. The new amounts on the bills and the amounts actually collected and passed on to the master finally agreed. The steward thus abandoned his earlier dishonesty. According to Ustazi, the parable has special relevance for both the tax collectors and Pharisees, reminding the former of their duty as disciples now to make restitution wherever possible, while at the same time warning the latter of their status as stewards for whom a day of reckoning was coming. End of quote. Now, in the dramatised documentary Parables of Jesus that's available on Amazon Prime, the interpretation that is given is that the steward is doing his master's dirty work of collecting high interest between 25 and 100%. So when the steward goes back to adjust the books, he lowers the debts so that they are now interest-free, since the law prohibited charging interest to other Jews. Now, the problem with this view is that the master is effectively the bad guy for charging such high interest, and the steward is the good guy for removing the interest on the loans. But we see that the manager is referred to as an unjust steward, not the good guy. Now, the major variance in discounts offered to the two debtors could potentially be an indicator of high interest, though there is no direct mention of any interest in the parable. Now, the more common point of view is that the unjust steward, in the deals that he cuts with the debtors, is actually cooking the books, not fixing them. Now, K.E. Bailey contends that any extras the steward may have received would have been under the table and off the record, and would not have been included in the accounts, and that the debt reductions authorised in verses 5 to 7 were therefore dishonest and would have meant economic loss for the master. Now, in verse 8, the steward is referred to as an unjust steward as opposed to someone correcting previous wrongs. So it's more likely that he was cooking the books rather than fixing them. Now, any extras he was making will most likely have been under the table and not reflected in the signed bills. The steward was no doubt making extra and misusing the money that he had access to. Now, in verse 8 we read, "So the master commended the unjust steward because he had dealt shrewdly." Now, if the deals that he cuts with the debtors were dishonest and done at the economic expense of his master, why does the master commend or praise him for acting wisely or shrewdly? Would he not be angry at these falsified bills? How do we make sense of this puzzling reaction from his master? Now, Matt Slick, in an article on this parable, answers this puzzling question this way. It would be safe to assume that there is some sort of celebrating occurring in the homes of the renters as they rejoice in what they think is the generosity of the landowner. Soon the whole community would be aware of the kind-heartedness of the landowner and think honourably of the generous landowner. Now, the landowner has got two alternatives. First, he could gather the renters and tell them that the reductions were unauthorised and therefore showing his stinginess and risking ridicule from them and the community. Second, he can keep silent accepting the praises even now being showered on him, and allowed the clever steward to get away with the scheme. Now, obviously, the steward knew the master was a generous person, otherwise he would not have taken such a risk, as he wasn't jailed after all to begin with. So we see that the actions of the steward were fraudulent, but the underlying foresight and skill is quite amazing, as seen from the position that the master later finds himself in. Now, Jesus then goes on to say, and I'm going to read this in the English Revised Version, which makes it much clearer. The master told the dishonest manager that he had done a smart thing. Yes, worldly people are smarter in their business with each other than spiritual people are. I tell you, use the worldly things you have now to make friends for later. Then, when those things are gone, you'll be welcome into a home that lasts forever. Now, unbelievers are often wiser in the things of the world than believers are about the things of God. They often show much more drive and ambition to achieve their worldly goals than the drive and ambition that many believers show in reaching their ultimate goal of God's kingdom. Now, following on from that, Jesus is telling us to use the wealth and money that we are entrusted with in this life to benefit others, so when we fail or die, we'll be received into the kingdom of God. Now, Jesus then goes on to say, starting in verse 10, he who is faithful in the least is also faithful in much, and he who is unjust in the least is also unjust in much. Therefore, if you have not been faithful in the unrighteous mammon, who will entrust the true riches to you? And if you have not been faithful in that which is another's, who shall give you that which is your own? No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be loyal to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. Now, we've already seen that the unjust steward was unfaithful in the unrighteous mammon, or the money he was entrusted with. Yet Jesus is telling us to act in a completely different way by being faithful with whatever money and wealth that we are entrusted with in this life. Now, these verses clearly show that the lesson we are to learn from the unjust steward is not his dishonesty. If one is faithful in little, then one will be faithful in much. And similarly, if one is dishonest in little, he will also be dishonest in much. If we can't be faithful with earthly wealth, which isn't even ours to begin with, then how can we be entrusted with the true riches of God's kingdom? Now, Jesus concluded by saying, no man can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he'll be loyal to one and despise the other. Now, wealth can have a corrupting influence, and greed for money often leads people to commit terrible sins. Now, wealth is not inherently evil, but the love of many can lead to all sorts of sins, as Paul wrote about in 1 Timothy 6, verse 1. Now, this brings up an interesting question. What is our attitude towards the things that we are entrusted with in this life? Now, in 1 Peter 4:10, the Apostle Peter writes, as each one has received a gift, minister it to one another, as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. Now, we each have been given different talents, physical resources, and tremendous knowledge of the plan and laws of God. Do we look at what we have as just our money, our talents, and our time? Or do we look at our money as God's money, our talents as God's talents, and even our time as God's time that he has given us to use to benefit others and further his goals? Now, if we look at anything we have as not as ours, but God's to use wisely, we will give what we have more freely and be less worried about having enough, trusting God that he'll provide what we need, since what we have really is God's to begin with. Now, that mindset can be truly transformational and help us to be far more willing to give and to share with others. Now, in conclusion, the unjust steward's plan was to put the master into a difficult position. By lowering the debts in an unauthorised manner, the master had to either renege on the popular deals and make himself look bad with his clients, or leave the deals and save faith with his clients at some financial cost. Now, if the worst happened, the deals made the steward popular with his clients, who he'd hoped would take him in if he lost his job. And Jesus encourages us not to mimic his dishonesty, but to use money in a smart way. Now, first of all, he wants us to be faithful with whatever money or other resources we are given in this life, whether a little or a lot. Second, he wants us to use our money and resources to serve and help others. And third, he wants us to never allow the pursuit of wealth to ever displace God's rightful place as number one in our lives.